provide a little bit more lumber within their supply, but there's no way that they can replace the imports coming from Canada.
A tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such, and yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
Canada does not dump lumber into the United States. And we will continue to make the case that these current and proposed duties are unjustified.
A family in Arizona just lost their dream home, not because they couldn't save, not because rates climbed, but because a single policy decision signed quietly in Washington added $10,000 to the price of the lumber framing their walls. They never saw it coming. Most Americans haven't, because this isn't a headline about trade wars or diplomatic spats. It is a silent tax on the American dream, levied one board foot at a time, and it is accelerating right now. In April 2026, Canadian softwood lumber entering the United States faced a combined tariff rate of roughly 45%. That number is not abstract. It is a direct injection of cost into the very skeleton of residential construction. And it is reshaping who can afford to build, who can afford to buy, and which communities will grow or stall in the years ahead. The mechanism is brutally simple. The United States does not produce enough softwood lumber to meet its own demand. It imports roughly 30% of what it consumes. Canada supplies about 85% of that gap. The type of lumber at the center of this dispute, spruce, pine, fir, is not easily swapped for domestic alternatives. Building codes, engineering specifications, and contractor familiarity create a dependency that cannot be undone overnight. So when a 45% cost increase is applied to a material that sits at the core of every wood-framed home, the ripple effect is immediate and compounding. Builders operate on razor-thin margins, fixed contracts, and financing that demands predictability. When one of their most essential inputs becomes volatile and expensive, projects do not just get more expensive, they get delayed, scaled back, canceled. Lenders grow cautious, developers pause, and the entire pipeline of new housing begins to constrict. This is not a theoretical risk. Industry estimates from the National Association of Home Builders indicate that tariffs on lumber and related building materials are adding between $5,000 and $10,000 to the cost of an average new home. That increase lands in a market where affordability is already fractured. Mortgage rates remain elevated. Inventory is tight. Demand outpaces supply. Every additional cost layer pushes more buyers to the sidelines. U.S. housing starts declined 4% in 2024 and fell another 2.3% in 2025. The tariff escalation is not the sole cause of that slowdown, but it is an accelerant. When supply is constrained and costs rise simultaneously, the result is a market that becomes increasingly fragile. Fewer homes are built. Prices remain high. The gap between what people need and what they can access widens. But this story has a second act, and it unfolds north of the border. Reduced access to the U.S. market has triggered a wave of mill curtailments, closures, and job losses across Canadian forestry regions. In British Columbia, employment in sawmills and wood preservation fell by roughly 20% between 2017 and 2025. Quebec saw a 13% decline. Industrial capacity utilization in wood product manufacturing slipped to 75% by late 2025. These are not temporary adjustments, they are structural cuts. Domtar permanently shut down its Crofton facility, eliminating 350 jobs. West Fraser Timber curtailed its oriented strandboard mill in high-level Alberta, recording a $200 million asset impairment. Canadian lumber production dropped nearly 7% in 2025 alone. Total North American output is now at its lowest level in a decade, and that decline is not easily reversed. It takes years to build capacity. Only months to shut it down. One mill operator in Prince George described the shift in stark operational terms. Within 6 months of the 45% duty environment taking hold, production across his facilities dropped from full capacity to roughly 25%. That is not a slowdown. That is a contraction. When mills reduce output at that scale, the supply chain tightens from the source. Even if demand remains strong in the United States, the material itself becomes harder to secure consistently. That feeds directly back into price volatility and project delays. The Canadian government has responded with significant financial intervention. $2.35 billion committed since August 2025, including loans, grants, and retraining programs supporting more than 6,000 workers. The Canadian Forest Sector Transformation Task Force delivered its report in mid-April 2026, outlining strategies to modernize the industry. The Build Canada Homes initiative is prioritizing domestic wood products in federal construction. But these efforts face a dual pressure. Their primary export market is constrained by tariffs, while domestic housing demand is weakening at the same time. In the Greater Toronto Area, housing starts fell by more than one-third through 2025. Condominium starts dropped over 50% from recent peaks. Mills cannot rely on local demand to compensate for lost U.S. access. They are exposed to a shrinking market on both sides. Here is what makes this situation uniquely dangerous. The tariff structure itself is not fixed, it is under active review. On March 9, 2026, the U.S. Department of Commerce launched a new administrative review covering Canadian softwood lumber shipments throughout the entire 2025 calendar year. Final results are expected by January 31, 2027. Early indications from preliminary findings suggest some rates could move downward. Anti-dumping duties might decline to 10.66% from 20.53%. Countervailing duties could adjust slightly to 14.17% from 14.63%. That would bring the combined rate to 24.83%. Paired with the 10% Section 232 tariff, the total could settle around 34.83%, a noticeable drop from the current 45.16% level. But even that potential reduction does not immediately solve the problem. The industry operates on long planning cycles. Uncertainty itself carries a cost that cannot be easily reversed. Builders who have already delayed projects or adjusted budgets based on higher tariff expectations are not likely to instantly reverse course. Mills that have reduced capacity cannot simply restart operations at full scale without time, capital, and confidence that conditions will remain stable long enough to justify the move. And there is also the possibility that tariffs could expand rather than shrink. Ongoing monitoring under Section 232 includes the potential to extend coverage to additional wood products, including hardwoods. That would widen the scope of the dispute and increase the number of materials affected by trade restrictions. That possibility adds another layer of unpredictability to a market that is already struggling to maintain stability. The legal battle surrounding this dispute is unfolding in parallel. Canada is challenging U.S. duties through both the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement Dispute Resolution System and World Trade Organization processes. Those mechanisms typically take between 18 and 24 months to reach a conclusion. The timeline itself highlights a critical disconnect. The impacts of tariffs are being felt immediately. The solutions are moving at a pace that does not match the urgency of the situation on the ground. Financially, the scale is already enormous. Canadian softwood producers have paid more than $8 billion in U.S. duties since 2017. Approximately $2 billion in additional interest has accumulated over time. The total value of duties and interest now exceeds $10 billion. These payments are held as cash deposits by U.S. authorities, effectively tying up capital that could otherwise be reinvested into operations, modernization, or expansion. That restriction on liquidity further limits the ability of producers to adapt to changing market conditions. The roots of this conflict stretch back decades. The modern phase of the softwood lumber dispute intensified in 2017, although tensions date back to the early 1980s. The core disagreement is structural. In Canada, most forests are publicly owned. Companies pay stumpage fees to provincial governments. In the United States, timber is largely harvested from privately owned land where prices are determined by market forces. American producers argue this creates an uneven playing field. Canadian industry groups maintain that U.S. tariffs are unjustified and distort trade. This is not a dispute that can be resolved by adjusting a single rate. It involves reconciling two fundamentally different systems of resource management and pricing. Each has its own economic and political backing. The result is a cycle where temporary agreements expire, disputes reemerge, and new rounds of tariffs are imposed. A pattern that repeats rather than resolves. Meanwhile, shifts are already happening within the industry itself. Some Canadian firms are increasing their presence in U.S. forests and expanding production within American borders. This allows them to bypass tariffs entirely on that portion of their output. It is a strategy that reflects a broader trend toward restructuring supply chains to minimize exposure to trade barriers. but it also underscores how policy decisions can reshape investment patterns in ways that have long-term implications for both countries. From a market share perspective, the balance is already changing. Canadian sawmills accounted for about 21% of U.S. lumber consumption recently, down from 33% in 2016. Domestic U.S. production now supplies around 72% of consumption. Other countries contribute roughly 7%. That shift shows a gradual erosion of Canada's role in the U.S. market, even though it remains the dominant import source. It highlights how sustained trade pressure can alter the structure of supply over time. Individual companies are experiencing these changes in measurable ways. Preliminary duty adjustments indicate that Canfor could see its total levies drop to 31.02% from 47.59%. West Fraser's rates could decline to 20.70% from 26.47%. Resolute FP Canada might see its duties fall to 24.95% from 35.16%. These variations demonstrate how the impact of tariffs is not uniform across the industry, but even reduced rates still represent a significant cost that must be absorbed somewhere within the supply chain. Back in the housing market, the connection becomes increasingly clear. Every percentage point in tariffs translates into higher material costs. Those costs accumulate quickly across the thousands of components required to build a home. When builders face increases of this scale, the options are limited. They can pass the costs on to buyers, reduce the size or quality of projects, delay construction altogether. In many cases, all three responses occur simultaneously across different segments of the market. The result is a housing system that becomes less efficient and less accessible. Fewer homes are built despite ongoing demand. The ones that are completed come at a higher price point. Affordability moves further out of reach. This dynamic does not only affect new construction. Renovation and remodeling projects also rely on lumber. Existing homeowners face higher costs as well. The impact of tariffs extends beyond new builds into the broader housing ecosystem. Looking ahead, the outcome of the current review process and ongoing negotiations will play a crucial role in determining whether this pressure eases or intensifies. But the underlying lesson is already visible. The interconnected nature of the North American lumber market means that policies affecting one side inevitably ripple across the entire system. Stability depends on alignment between supply and demand across borders. When that alignment is disrupted, the consequences are felt in production, pricing, and ultimately in the homes that people are trying to build or buy. As the situation continues to develop, the question is no longer whether the softwood lumber dispute is affecting the housing market. It is how far those effects will extend and how long they will last. Billions of dollars are already tied up in duties. Production capacity is shrinking in key regions. Demand for housing still outpaces supply. The next decisions made by policymakers, industry leaders, and trade negotiators will determine whether this pressure begins to ease or continues to build into something even more disruptive. So if this trade conflict continues to evolve the way it has over the past decade, what does that mean for the future of building homes in North America? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more. We will catch you in the next.